Nihilism, a philosophical view that negates traditional values, beliefs, and institutions. Nihilism is a view that sees all kinds of orders, structures, systems, of ideas of good and evil, morals and ethics, as emerging from within the human will, the human desire, the human ego. Ultimately, however, upon this basis or baselessness, you could even say, of meaninglessness and nothingness and an empty space, and that they all emerge within the human will as out of this need to, one, get ourselves away from this feeling of uncertainty and anxiety that comes from a meaningless existence, and two, to give us a feeling of control and confidence and ultimately fulfillment from being able to hold on to some kind of meaning construct in our lives, something that tells us what is good, evil, morally and ethically correct and incorrect. Also, nihilism is a view that, even though certain thinkers and philosophers discussed it and wrote about it before the 20th century, really from the early 20th century onward, it started becoming popularized. And so you could say that in the span of human development, it's a relatively recent emergence of a worldview. And so with all of this, we're going to look today into how the meaninglessness and nothingness of life described by nihilism, how that stands up to the meaning of life that is described by the wisdom of Kabbalah. How Kabbalah describes that there is a meaning of life, and Kabbalah offers a method to attain the meaning of life. So we're going to see that in relation to nihilism. For example, nihilism comes and says that any teaching that says that provides meaning ultimately is based upon this, you could call it a nihilistic black hole of meaninglessness. So is Kabbalah just one of several orders of ideas of good and evil, moral and ethics, or is it something completely different? So that's one of the things we're going to look at today. And another thing we're going to look at today as well is how and where nihilism fits in to the timeline, you could say, of human development that the wisdom of Kabbalah describes, and why it's a worldview that is relatively recent and you could say relevant in our time, something that you can see a lot of, especially in Western culture today. So we're going to get into all that in today's Kabbalah Explained Simply. I'm Marcus, and we're going to get into it right after this. Okay, so to start with, Kabbalist Yehuda Ashlag, Baal HaSulam, who's the most renowned Kabbalist of the 20th century, the only Kabbalist who wrote commentaries to the Book of Zohar and the writings of the Ari, such as the Tree of Life. He's a Kabbalist who wrote a very enormous amount of text, from several essays and articles to multi-volume textbooks such as the study of the 10 Sfirot and the Sulam commentary on the Book of Zohar. And out of all of this amount of writing that Baal HaSulam left us, he wrote 2 short sentences directly relating to nihilism. And we're going to get into those today, and we're going to open them up and really see where his critique of nihilism fits into this picture, and how the wisdom of Kabbalah and what it describes, the attainments that the wisdom of Kabbalah describes, how that fits into the solution for his critique of nihilism. So without further ado, we're already going to open up this quote. Here you see it here. It's from the writings of the last generation. Nihilism. Not complete nihilism, but nihilism of values, such as Nietzsche with regard to the values of Christianity, meaning all the values in the religious conduct, ethics and politics that have been thus far accepted in the perception of humanism. All these are compromises in the measurements of egoism, of the individual, the state, or God's servant. And I say that any measure of egoism is faulty and detrimental, and there is no other arrangement except altruism in the individual, the public, and the Lord. So this might be pretty tough to understand. We'll already start getting into it now and breaking it down a bit. So we're saying that nihilism, the nihilism of values, meaning all the values in religious conduct, ethics, and politics that have been thus far accepted in the perception of humanism, they are compromises in the measurements of egoism of the individual, the state, or God's servant. So what is this, if we break it down, that nihilism and all that's describing there are compromises in the measurements of egoism. To put it shortly, nihilism as a worldview still exists as a philosophical theory, a philosophical view, which ultimately means that it exists within the boundaries, within the limits of the human ego, and it doesn't let us go beyond that human ego. It doesn't let us see what's outside of that ego. It doesn't give us access to a worldview that is outside of that, but rather it describes a certain kind of limit, you could say, within the ego that sees that, within the boundaries of the ego, if we really try to look beyond all kinds of constructs that it makes, we reach this, you could say, this blackness, this emptiness that's out there, where we can't pinpoint any real meaning behind all these things. So, but at the end of the day, it says that it resides within the ego, and all these assortings that it does, putting up all kinds of things, you could say, against each other that we create from the ego, that itself is the ego also working. So they are all compromises in the measurements of egoism, of the individual, the state, of God's servant. And I say that any measure of egoism is faulty and detrimental, and there is no other arrangement except altruism. So we'll just go into this, that what does it mean here that any measure of egoism is faulty and detrimental, that he talks about here. So after defining nihilism as still residing within the ego, still not letting us get outside of the ego, after defining it as something that exists within the constructs of our own mind, of our own philosophizing and theorizing. So it says that any workings of the ego at the end of the day are faulty and detrimental. So this we need to look into a bit, because what does it mean that any measure of egoism is faulty and detrimental? To get to this, we'll start to do a little bit of a drawing. And so if we look at the ego, firstly, what is the ego? What is egoism that is talking about? So we could summarize it like this. We have a will to receive, or a desire to receive, which is ultimately a will to receive pleasure, a will to receive fulfillment, that at the basis of every single one of our desires, we want to feel pleasure. So that's, you could draw the desire like this. We have this will to receive pleasure, wanting always to receive pleasure like this. But it doesn't stop there. That's not the full definition of what the ego is. You could say the will to receive plus an intention to receive that pleasure for self-benefit. So that's really the definition of the ego or egoism. The will to receive pleasure and the intention to receive that pleasure for personal benefit alone. So that is at the basis of every one of our desires, from desires for food, sex, family, money, honor, control, knowledge, and even desires for spirituality, to realize oneself in the world, to find meaning in life. At the end of the day, all of these desires are desires for pleasure, desires for enjoyment and desires for fulfillment. And each one of these desires aims to receive that pleasure inwardly into some kind of space within me, where that is called to receive pleasure with an intention for self-benefit, for personal benefit. You could even say that it's with an intention to benefit at the expense of others, with the intention to benefit at the expense of nature. In short, anything outside of us. We are constantly looking on how to extract maximum pleasure with minimal effort, and we constantly have this inward receptive apparatus constantly working on us to try to receive as much pleasure as we can at every single moment. And that gives us gives rise to all kinds of thoughts, to all kinds of worldviews and all kinds of activity that we do, but all within this, you could say, corporeal framework that is defined as desires for food, sex, family, money, honor, control, and knowledge. It all fits within this framework. So that's egoism. Now, what does it mean that any measure of egoism, anything happening in this framework, is faulty and detrimental? So, faulty and detrimental. So what makes this quality, which really we're born with this quality and it's working on us at every single moment, and it gives rise to several worldviews, including a worldview such as nihilism. And what does it mean that it's faulty and detrimental? One, it's that it's an incomplete perception of reality. Now we could say incomplete perception. What does that mean? That our ego is an incomplete perception of reality. It means that at the end of the day, by receiving pleasure, by having this intention to receive from other people and nature, we're constantly using, just look at our five senses, for instance, sight, smell, touch, hearing, and taste. These five senses are constantly absorbing information from an unknown outside source, unknown to these five senses. And the five senses limit that information significantly. We're talking about limiting from billions of bits to just a few hundreds of thousands of bits of information at any given moment. And then that information is further filtered by our mind, which ultimately at every single given moment, we're given this picture in the mind, which is the most self-serving picture out of everything going on right now. For example, right now, I'm in a room, with a computer in front of me, and there's lighting, and there's, a wall here, a green wall. I didn't even notice the wall was green over here in front of me until just now that I paid attention to that. There's so much information around us at every single moment that we're just not paying attention to, because we're built in from our birth. Our inborn human nature and makeup is such that we're constantly made to want to only perceive what's most desirable, what's most pleasurable for us at every single moment. So that's our human nature, and it's also an incomplete perception of reality. We have to be aware of how we have incomplete knowledge at every single given moment because of this makeup. We still need to understand, how is that detrimental? We can already understand from that how it's faulty. So let's get into another point here. 2 is that it's a perception that is built on detachment. So I perceive myself as ultimately detached from billions of other people, billions of other objects and things, nature on its level, other levels, still vegetative and animate. I perceive in this way where there is this self, this me, and billions of other things in the world that I'm seemingly detached from, and also all the other planets and stars and asteroids and suns in the universe, that I'm completely detached from that. That's how it perceives that. It is only focused on the ego is only focused on receiving pleasure from all that into some kind of space within ourselves, which we also can't really tangibly get a grasp on. But at every single moment, there's this pleasure coming into us, and it differentiates between this me, which is my desires at every single moment and what's fulfilling them or what's trying to fulfill them, and all this information outside of us, from still nature, vegetative nature, animate nature, and people. And it's as if there's me and all of this as two separate things, or me and all of this as several separate things, but it perceives in this way that it's all detached. It doesn't see the threads connecting between me and others. It doesn't perceive that there is this interconnection and integrality that is at the basis of all of nature, and that is at the basis of human relations. And it doesn't perceive ourselves as having some kind of relationship where if I do a certain action, or even if I think a certain thought, that influences a person on the other side of the planet. We don't perceive like that in our egoistic makeup. It's part of our incomplete perception, and it's also another characteristic of it is feeling detached from others. Why can that be faulty? And why can that be even more so detrimental? Very simply, because if I perceive myself as separate from other beings, so then it justifies me, exploiting them for my personal benefit. If what's real to me at any given moment is the fact that I have certain desires to receive pleasure, so that really is the primary, most important thing, to receive pleasure from external sources. So we can see in our world, it doesn't take very long to think about how all kinds of situations and states happen where people exploit others, manipulate others, abuse others for personal benefit, all in the name of personal benefit, all in the name of, me placing myself up higher and getting pleasure from them and feeling pleasure in such a way. And it's detrimental. Why? It mightn't seem detrimental to the person who's doing that, at least in the short term, but it's detrimental because it brings about suffering. It brings about all kinds of problems, crises, on all sorts of scales: personal, social, ecological, even global. So that's how it can be thought of as detrimental. And another one. So we have incomplete perception, detachment, and also the fulfillments we get. I need to duck a bit so we can see that. The fulfillments we get are transient. I'll just write full. Transient fulfillments. So this is another aspect of the human ego being faulty or detrimental. So what does it mean that our fulfillments are transient? It means that, well, actually, let's bring back the diagram. It means that any single pleasure that I get, anything that comes in this form like this with an intention to benefit myself, reaches this point here. We feel it as some kind of pleasure. Some are more instantaneous than others. But it's never long-lasting. It always dissipates. It always evaporates. It always fades away, any pleasure that we get. The classic example is, I might, have my favorite food, pizza, for instance, and, we'll be really hungry and want to eat, and then we finally get to eat, and then it's the moment where the desire meets its pleasure, and that first moment is always the best. We might enjoy the first, slice, second slice, third slice. But the more we eat, the less we want the pizza, until it reaches a point where if I'll keep eating more and more pizzas, it'll even make me sick, and I could end up vomiting from that. So that's a situation here with the fulfillments being transient. Any fulfillment we get in the egoistic perception of reality is short-lived. Our whole lives. We always have a start and end point to our life as well as we know it in this world too. It's another fact. It's another aspect of us living according to a nature which is egoistic, which ultimately is transient and which fades away. So Baal HaSulam sees these things. He can point out the faultiness and detrimental nature of nihilism as being one construct of many within this will to receive that's always looking to fulfill itself. But he doesn't stop there. The thing with a Kabbalist is that a Kabbalist attains another side of reality, another aspect of reality, which allows the Kabbalist to look at the ego truly from a side and be able to see its limits, see all kinds of workings within it that reach those limits, and explain to us what we can do in order to ultimately rise above the ego and enter a new reality. And what's that new reality? We'll go back into this excerpt and see it. It says here, and there is no other arrangement except altruism in the individual, the public, and the Lord. Without getting too deep into it, let's just talk about this opposite to egoism that he mentions here, because here he mentions the solution to this problem of the faulty and detrimental nature of egoism in altruism. So with altruism, we also have to understand what does he mean by altruism, the same as we needed to understand what he means by egoism. So let's do another picture here. So we have understandings of altruism in our world. Let's just start by showing egoism over here. So we have egoism, and what we showed as being the definition of egoism before can be described as receiving in order to receive. That was the description of, it's another way of saying will to receive pleasure with an intention to receive the pleasure for personal benefit. So receiving in order to receive. Okay, so that's plain egoism as we just talked about it before. Then, also within the realm of the human ego, within our corporeal reality, we have a situation which is called giving in order to receive. Giving in order to receive. So usually when we think of altruism at face value, as we might know altruism until now, the idea of giving, the idea of selflessness, it's usually this one, this giving in order to receive, which still is in the boundaries of egoism. Let's just draw a boundary line here. Yeah. So this is the altruism we usually think of. And really, this altruism, we could call it, this one here, we could give it the name corporeal altruism. Several researchers have also discussed the centrality of the human ego and the fact that even the seemingly most selfless acts, at the end of the day, we do them because it makes us feel good. I go and help someone who needs help at the end of the day because it makes me feel good to do that. We're not saying it's a bad thing or anything like this, but we're saying that this is a phenomenon that would be naive to think that doing some act of giving in this world would not be done with the intention to ultimately benefit myself out of that act of giving. So that's what we generally think of as altruism in this world, and that's not the altruism that Baal HaSulam was talking about in this article. Because as I said, Baal HaSulam is a Kabbalist. A Kabbalist is a person who has attained a higher reality, a reality which is defined by the attainment of a force of altruism, an altruistic force, which you could also call it as a spiritual force. And that exists up here. Let's say that this is the altruism that Baal HaSulam is talking about up here. So we could also define two levels there. One, which is described as giving in order to give. Which really is not incomprehensible in our current reality. To give, to be in this state of bestowal without any intention for personal benefit attached to that giving. It might seem like we can do stuff like this in our world, but if we really examine our intentions at every single given moment, we will see how every single act of giving that we do in this world ultimately has this attachment of an intention to benefit myself out of that act of giving or even thought of giving. So giving in order to give describes a first level of what's called spiritual attainment, a first level of crossing a certain barrier between our corporeal world and what's known as a spiritual world, or a world of bestowal, an altruistic world. Giving in order to give, to give with this pure intention of giving, that thought of giving, that intention of giving, that act of giving will not return to me, that it'll remain outside of me. It's as I said, it's something incomprehensible to our current ego, but this is a first, you could say, grasp of that reality, of the altruistic reality and the altruistic quality, and this altruism that Baal HaSulam is describing. And secondly, a higher level is receiving in order to give, which we won't even go there today. Just put it here as a mention. So, when we described giving in order to receive as corporeal altruism, so up here we can call these ones spiritual altruism. And that's the altruism that a Kabbalist attains. Now, how is that an attainment, and how is that a solution to the faulty and detrimental aspects of egoism? That Baal HaSulam put nihilism within those boundaries of egoism, and not letting as a description of something that doesn't let us exit the boundaries of egoism. And then he puts altruism there as a solution to that there's no other arrangement except altruism, on all kinds of scales, individual, social, spiritual. So in this setup, what gives us that perception of altruism? What lets us see a reality where we pass through levels of giving in order to give and then receiving in order to give? That is precisely done by the tool that a Kabbalist uses to perceive reality, a tool that needs to be attained, a tool which is described as a sense, an altruistic sense. Sometimes it's called a sixth sense. In the language of Kabbalah, it's called a masach, and we could even draw it right here, that this boundary between this world and the upper world is called a masach. Masach is a Hebrew word. It literally translates as screen. And with this tool, we enter this higher reality. We enter this altruistic reality that Baal HaSulam talks about, how there's no other arrangement except this one, which offers us to go beyond the boundaries of the ego. So where's he talking from when he's talking to us about this? Where's he going with this? How can we access such a higher reality to discuss it? Firstly, we have to understand how this is a solution for these faulty and detrimental aspects. That by attaining access to a higher reality, let's say let's make a parallel picture over here. So we have our desire to receive, or our will to receive, So that remains. Yeah, the will to receive pleasure. That's the matter of creation. That's our nature to begin with. A desire to receive pleasure at every single moment. We can't get away from that. It's what was initially created. But we have the ability to change the intention upon it, as we mentioned, to apply this tool called a masach, a screen. And instead of that pleasure going down and evaporating inside this egoistic desire to receive with an intention to receive for personal benefit, we gain the ability to bestow that pleasure back outwardly to other people, to other parts of nature, but in short, outwardly. We bestow that pleasure out there, and that's the definition of this altruism that Baal HaSulam talks about as being the solution for the faulty and detrimental nature of egoism. So we have this will to receive, and then this is an intention. Instead of an intention for personal benefit, you could say it's an intention for benefiting others and nature. Okay, and how does that solve our problem? One, really it's the opposites of the things we just described before. By attaining this new sense, by attaining this altruistic sense, by attaining this screen, this sixth sense, by having access to this intention to benefit others and nature, this altruistic quality, so what does that grant us? First and foremost, it grants us complete perception. What does it mean, complete perception? You know, if incomplete perception was defined by us absorbing information from an unknown external source, coming through our five senses limiting that information, filtering it, our mind, once again, filtering the information that we get from our senses, and it's all being filtered and limited into this picture that is most self-serving at every given moment. And that describes the incomplete perception of reality that we have in our ego. So the complete perception that we have in altruism, it comes from attaining access to perceiving outside of our ego, literally. All this information out here, by bestowing to it, what actually happens is we become like that quality. What we fail to see in our egoistic makeup is that there is a constant invisible force that is bestowing upon us, that is bestowing to us, that is giving to us. The force of nature at its root is an altruistic force. By remaining in our egoism, we are 100% opposite to that force. You could say infinitely opposite to that force. And when we attain this intention to benefit others, to benefit nature, this altruistic intention, so it's considered that we attain similarity of form or equivalence of form with the very force of nature that's constantly working on us. Kabbalists also call that force of nature the creator. The creator from the word boreh, come and see, meaning that we have to attain that quality, to come and see it in order to believe it. Meaning it's not a belief that is built on blind faith, but it's a belief that's built on attainment. That only once we attain, Kabbalists have a saying for it, that come and see that the Lord is good. Or we will know you from your actions, meaning we will know the creator, we will know this force of nature from its action, meaning its active bestowal towards us. Meaning when we attain that same act of bestowal towards it, ultimately, so then we reveal the creator. And that's what the wisdom of Kabbalah leads us to. And that's all done with this tool that we attain in the process, this tool called the screen, this tool called the masach in Hebrew. And that grants us complete perception because it gives us access to perceiving literally the way nature perceives. We lack that access in our egoism. We're always still researching through sciences and through all kinds of means to try to understand how nature works. But here, literally, you learn, you could say on your flesh, that this is how nature works, in this mode, in this form. And we actually start learning the ways of nature by acquiring that same altruistic form, this complete perception of reality. So secondly, how it solves this problem of the faulty and detrimental nature of egoism, how altruism solves it. Altruism in this sense that we're discussing now is, if we remembered the second point about the faulty nature of egoism, it was that we had this perception of being detached from everyone and everything around us. So here, when we attain this new sense and attain an altruistic attitude and approach and attainment of reality, we literally see the connection between all things that are currently invisible to us in our egoism, things that we simply don't see in our inborn egoism. What does it mean? It means that I perceive myself as being, sorry about that. I perceive myself as being completely connected to all other people and to nature on all of its levels. I see that any thought or act that I do ripples throughout this entire system of nature and literally affects every single person and every single thing, now and in the future and in all times. It's a perception that's completely alien to us in our egoistic perception of reality. But when we attain that altruistic intention and access to reality above our ego with the tool called the screen that we get by studying the method of Kabbalah, not just studying, but applying the method of Kabbalah. So then we literally feel this complete connection to everyone and everything around us. Similar to how you could say cells or organs feel themselves in a body. I'm saying similar because it's not exactly the same. It's a more conscious, a higher level of perception of that, because cells and organs are automatically made by nature to literally receive what they need for their sustenance, for their existence, and give the rest of their abilities, give all of their surplus to the benefit of the whole body. Why do they act like that? Because they perceive the whole body as being something greater than them. And everything that they receive at every single given moment, they literally give it to the whole body because they feel themselves as one big self. Meaning the definition of self changes when we attain this new sense and attain that altruistic perception of reality. Our definition of self shifts from this egoistic self that I perceive now, this one that seems detached from billions of other people and things, to one where all of this picture around us, literally the whole universe, becomes this self of mine, becomes me. And every single thing that's coming to me at every single moment, if I'm in this mode, I'm also in a mode of bestowing it. And in this, I have a form of bestowal, an intention to bestow at every single moment for every single impulse, reception of pleasure that's coming to me. It's being fed back into the system. And that leads us to the third point, because when we're in this continual feedback to other people and to nature in such a way, so then if we remember the third problem, it was that we have transient pleasure only in our egoism. And in this case, we have, let's just fix it up, continuous fulfillment. Just write full here. Because if we look at this, literally we're receiving pleasure, and we have a new sense here, a new approach to reality, where we're giving it back, and we're in this constant feedback loop. We literally feel a continuous, unending mode of pleasure. We attain access to a whole other level of reality. We have to understand here that nature which is an altruistic force, which is a thought that is functioning constantly with total care and love towards everything that it creates. You don't have to even take that statement as anything that you need to believe. Just take it as a hypothesis that the Kabbalists say that that's how it is. But, not to take, it shouldn't be taken on blind faith. But they're saying, take a method that we provide where several other people throughout history have applied this method, apply it upon yourself, and then if you do so, then you will gain access to this, literally this higher level of reality, the level of reality where we are in this constant fulfillment, a constant, we feel fulfillment through giving, not through receiving. And when we feel fulfillment through giving, which is possible by attaining that sense that feels fulfillment through giving, so then we also feel pleasure is continuous, it's not transient, it doesn't dissipate and evaporate and fade away upon its reception. But on the contrary, the moment we receive it, we're feeding it back into the system, and we become like these healthy cells that are actually giving fuel, giving life, giving energy to the whole system that we're a part of, the whole natural system, which includes nature on all of its levels, still vegetative, animate, and human. So that's more or less how, in a nutshell, where Baal HaSulam positions nihilism here. That at the end of the day, nihilism, it's a philosophical view. It exists within the ego. It's problematic for anything to just remain in the ego. If something doesn't lift us above the ego, then what's going to happen is that ego is going to continually grow and reach points where we're just going to experience more and more problems. And especially when meaninglessness and nothingness come into the equation, which is what nihilism does in the whole evolutionary process, when that happens, then you could say there's also this upsurge in uncertainty, anxiety, and its offshoots. It's one of the reasons why there's greater amounts of depression, loneliness, stress, and phenomena like drug abuse and suicide, even mental illness taking place on the world, you could say on individual levels. On social levels, it gives rise to more phenomena like extremism. Lots of extremists, it's also a known thing that lots of extremists who are taken by an ideology to perform extreme acts like mass shootings, for instance, or terrorist acts, often they start off in this, you could say, nihilistic space, feeling some kind of meaninglessness, some kind of nothingness in life. In short, this pluralism and liberalism and individualism of Western society today, they feel it, I'm not saying everybody, but people who are drawn to extremism, they feel it as this oppression of meaninglessness and nothingness, something that really gives rise to a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. And an extremist worldview comes along and shares with them this hatred for a seeming society, a seeming values and systems around them that literally just provide them with no fulfillment, that literally cause them suffering, cause what they perceive as suffering to others around them. And then an extremist worldview can come along and with this shared enemy, it says, here's this enemy, this society that's causing you this. Here's what we can do with it. And, it can lead them to all kinds of, as I said, mass shootings, terrorism, and in short, extremism, extreme acts. So, that's another phenomena that emerges out of this faulty and detrimental nature of egoism when we remain within egoism and let egoism continually develop and grow as it does. So that's in a nutshell Baal HaSulam's couple of sentences here on nihilism. there's definitely more to it than that, but for the sake of the time we have and the purpose of this lesson, that's more or less where we'll look at it for that reason. But we'll also just mention a few things about how nihilism fits in this developmental timeline. As we mentioned, nihilism's a fairly recent development if you look at the whole span of human history and all kinds of worldviews and systems and belief systems and values that have emerged over the course of history. Nihilism is still fairly, a fairly new one in that whole span of things. As I mentioned, really from the early 20th century onwards, it started becoming more and more popular and more felt among more and more people. So how does that all fit into the equation? We'll also discuss how Kabbalah sees that. So let's just give a little bit of a timeline. First, there's this development of egoism all throughout history. Development of egoism. So that takes place throughout history. You've probably seen this diagram before. If you're not, then it means you need to watch more Kabbalah Explained Simply. It's how the wisdom of Kabbalah describes natural evolution, including human evolution, as this growth of desire from the still level through to the vegetative level, to the animate level, to the human level. And each level is defined by literally more desire to receive than its previous level. It's expressed as having desires for food, sex, family on the still level, money on the vegetative level, honor, control, knowledge, and finally the desire for spirituality, the desire for discovering the meaning of life at the human level. And we could say a lot of things about it, but ultimately the development of egoism leads to a point where, when we're closer to this point here, when we're ready to make that ascent into the altruistic reality, which really comes after this, you could say, it's an entrance into a whole new reality up there. So when we're feeling this desire more and more emerging, when the desire for the meaning of life, it's really felt as a desire that feels the meaninglessness and the nothingness of all these previous levels. It feels ultimately that all these things, as much as they do provide transient fulfillments and meaning constructs and all kinds of things for us, they fail to give us true lasting fulfillment. So nihilism, then it makes sense how nihilism emerges at a period around the 20th century, when the desires start growing to a point where this desire for spirituality and the limits of the desire for knowledge, when these desires start really coming up, because it really shows on a mass scale what Kabbalists have talked about from the book of Zohar. It was talked about how toward the end of the 20th century, for instance, the desire for spirituality would emerge, and the wisdom of Kabbalah would be needed in order to provide them an access to the meaning of life, to fulfill that desire. Baal HaSulam also talked about it, about the end of the 20th century. Kabbalists in the 16th century, including the Ari, mentioned how from that point on, the world would be ready for Kabbalah. That Kabbalah from that point on was able to be revealed to the masses, whereas up until then it was studied in a concealed way. Why? Simply because the desire hadn't ripened until that point came along. So there's this development of egoism taking place to a point where it leads to its satiation. And really we can see that in our era. What we could call the end of egoistic development. That there is an end to this ego's growth, and simply put, as the end being the expression of this new desire for meaning and purpose, and it's like the nucleus of the next state, where when we truly clarify that desire and reach it, you could say at its nucleus, then we reach a point where we see that, as he said, there's no other arrangement except altruism in his quote. We reach a point where we discover that we need to, as if, flip egoism in order to discover the meaning of why it was created to begin with, and why we've been led through all this, you could say, suffering and evolution and everything to a certain point. So egoism develops to its satiation, meaning that we don't feel fulfilled in all these frameworks, desires, pleasures, values, systems that we've developed all the way up until today, and they've all been developed by the ego at certain levels of its development. And we feel that these things don't fulfill us because of the three ways that they are faulty and detrimental: the incompleteness that they're built on, the detachment that they're built on, and the transient nature of fulfillment that they're built on, together with the fact that the ego is always growing and getting bigger. So this blend equals crisis at the end of the day. It equals a whole bunch of problems that emerge in our society as a result of that faulty and detrimental ego that's always growing. Because the more it grows, the more we actually feel less fulfillment in all these things that previously fulfilled us. We keep trying to fulfill ourselves from them. We keep coming up with new ways of fulfilling ourselves through them. But the ego keeps growing and leads us to this point where that's where nihilism plays a certain transitional role here, because more and more people start feeling this meaninglessness and nothingness in their lives. And it leads us to all kinds of questions. It leads to a whole bunch of confusion. But really, it leads us to, if we go back here, it leads us to helplessness and despair. We'll put that as this next point here. That whether we feel it now, whether a person feels it, soon in the future, at the end of the day, we're going to feel more and more that we just simply won't be able to fulfill ourselves, because this new level of desire is emerging in us. Wanting fulfillment, but a different kind of fulfillment that we can't picture how to fulfill it. And we will keep trying to fulfill it with these lower levels of desire, but fail. And we're just going to feel this more and more, this helplessness and this despair from our egoistic development. And this is going to lead us to a need for change. We could say for a major change. This need for a major change, the need or lack or a desire, it's expressed by certain questions that we'll be asking more and more, like where are we headed? What's going on here? Where literally existential questions about our very existence on this planet, that will come from more and more of these feelings of helplessness, despair, suffering, that'll prod us to that. It's going to develop this desire more and more, and it'll prepare humanity more and more for a major change to take place. Then we come to a change that we'll undergo as a result of this need to change. When we do feel a true need to change, and we'll also have direction on how to undergo that change, so then we'll change. We'll change human nature, change of human nature. It's the change that we've been discussing. I'll just put it like this, from egoism to altruism. From this lower reality that we've been growing up in the whole time, the corporeal reality, the egoistic reality, to an altruistic reality, to one where we need to go through a certain transition feel all those phenomena of helplessness and despair, and reach a point where we reach a true need for a change. But together with that needs to be direction for that change. You could say education, a new kind of education. Not the same forms of education that have led us to where we are today, but a new form of education that leads us to make that altruistic change. And then, what's the next step in this process? We'll come to reveal that altruistic reality that we talked about and showed, at least in the diagram earlier. Revelation of higher reality. It'll become apparent to more and more people, and that will lead us, simply put, to a new humanity. One where those altruistic qualities that I mentioned of completeness, of complete perception of reality, one where we feel fulfillment is continuous, some kind of fulfillment of love and bestowal flowing through all parts of humanity, and where we don't feel detachment from each other, where we feel like we need to use others because they're going to use us if we don't use them, like we currently feel today. But one where we'll feel this genuine connection to others, where I'll feel other people as myself, and I'll relate to others as if I'm relating to myself. How do I relate to myself in this world? I relate to myself completely lovingly, even if we don't think that way. By nature, since we're wanting to receive pleasure into ourselves at every single moment, and that desire is working on us in such a way at every single moment. So when we invert that intention, that direction by which we receive pleasure outwardly, so then we discover this whole new space between us. It's as if there's this ocean of light, what you could call light, between us, this ocean of this force of love, bestowal, dwelling between us, and we just lack the receptor, the sense to perceive that. So once we gain the direction and the education to attain that sense, and once we gain also the right, you could say, social environment that supports that change, and we have all the means in place to attain it, so then we can undergo that change and we literally attain a new humanity. So also in relation to the means to attain it, so that's exactly what happens here. Let's say points 3, I'll just go use another color here. Points 3, 4, and 5 relate to the fact that there's a need for not all humanity will go through this change at once, but there's a critical mass of people who will undergo these changes first, meaning a critical mass of people who will feel this need for major change earlier than others, people who will undergo the method and the process to change the human nature earlier than others, you could say a pioneering group, and who will attain this revelation of the higher reality. And when they attain that, once a critical mass of people, even a small group, reaches that attainment, so they become as a conduit for that attainment to spread to all of humanity. When we really see the picture of our connectedness, on a broad scale, so then we see that even by raising even one person's consciousness, but let's say we're raising the consciousness of even a small group to a point where they enter that altruistic reality, then it's as if there's these tectonic plates of human consciousness which undergo a shift. And literally from within humanity, people all around the world will start feeling a certain change starting to take place, as if people start appreciating altruism more, start appreciating and thinking about others more without even knowing how it happened. You could call the pioneering group that undergoes this critical mass stage, meaning people who feel this need earlier than others and who undergo this change earlier than others. And there's nothing special about it that they're like, don't think that they're, maybe you could say they're special people, but no more special than a person who suddenly gets a desire to play the violin every day for 8 hours a day and become a professional violinist. They didn't really choose the desire. It's just, you could say, a certain role that they've been given to master a certain thing. And, they enter in an environment just like the violinist enters a conservatorium, a university for music, and, is involved in all kinds of environments that support that progress. So just like several people find themselves in this way in all kinds of career directions and other things like this. So likewise, you have a certain amount of people in the world who feel this need for a major change, this need for a spiritual change, and who are capable of undergoing the change of human nature. They gather as a group, they form a critical mass, and they reach this revelation of this higher altruistic reality, and then through their attainment of it, it literally spreads to others, even just on an internal level, even on just the fact that people's thoughts start undergoing an upgrade without people even knowing that. So that really wraps it up for this lesson. We'll just mention a few words that, since we're talked about a critical mass here, so that's exactly what we deal with here in Kabbu. You can see here a nice logo. So really at Kabbu, what we aim to do is, we put on lessons such as this one, and we have several courses, and we also have a structured learning path of the method of Kabbalah. Several courses also related to things around Kabbalah, from courses about the Zohar through to courses about what we were discussing now, changes in humanity, and courses to just help us understand all kinds of tendencies happening in humanity. And there's also special events, like, for example, there's a retreat coming up. We'll also put this one up here. We have a retreat coming up on October 1 to 3 in Iroquois Springs in Catskills Mountains, New York. But it's not just in Catskills Mountains, New York. Whoa, what do we have here? We're in the way of this link. There you go, retreat.kabbalah.info. You want to go there if you want to go to the retreat. But it's not just in person. In person's great. If you can manage to go in person, it's all well and good. But the retreat's also going to be virtual. There's going to be exclusive Zoom access to anyone who participates virtually. So, you can, we definitely recommend signing up for the retreat if you're already following the lessons and participating. If not, so use the link below to sign up to Kabbu. Just one thing, after this lesson, all these questions that you have and things that you want to ask, we'll be answering them in a special, again, exclusive Zoom just for Kabbu members for an hour after this lesson. So even if you join now, you still have time to come in, and I'll be there. I'm going to go run to this other computer where there's going to be Zoom, and I'll be in touch with you to answer your questions there. But that's just one of many things. We also have forums in Kabbu where you can ask questions to instructors really at any time. And as I mentioned, all the courses, probably the best thing that I would say is the best thing is the structured learning, meaning, a beginner's course, intermediate course, advanced course, a graduate environment where you can really start even putting groups together to mention, to do this, basically to apply the method of Kabbalah and to start receiving the feedback and attaining that sense that we're talking about. So that's all here at Kabbu. And that's about all we have time for today. So soon I'll see you all in the questions area in the Zoom in Kabbu. And it's been great talking with you all once again. And I look forward to seeing you once again in Kabbalah Explained Simply next time.